Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And it's a gloomy, gray morning here in Boston. Those of you who have been here realize that what I've just said is redundant. But I have been up since 4 a.m. I've listened to every word and enjoyed every word. And I am so honored and delighted to be part of this incredible conversation. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, why storytelling matters in medicine, and why you, yes, you, should write a book. You know, I'm often asked how I combine my writing career and my medical career. And I have to say, it always strikes me as just not quite the right question. Because to me, they're not different. Both of these activities are deeply rooted in a love of storytelling and a belief in the power of storytelling. So for me, writing and medicine have sort of fused over these past few years. And it just seems appropriate enough that since I've billed myself as a storyteller, I should tell you a little bit about my own story. I'm always fascinated to see where my patients choose to begin their stories. I find it very informative. Here's where I choose to begin my story today. This is spring of 1990. Here I am as a chief medical resident at Johns Hopkins Hospital. It took me decades to notice how few women were in this picture. More on that later. When I look at this picture, I see a young woman who had been given an enormous amount of responsibility early in her training and who felt entirely inadequate to the task. I had studied English literature in college. I was never much good at math and science. As I went through my training, I wasn't what we back then called a WSM. That was a designation we gave to the people, the doctors who just seemed to know everything, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of medicine. What did WSM stand for? World's Smartest Man. You know when I realized how sexist that was? About an hour ago. More on that too. Anyway, so the other thing I see here is a young woman who didn't realize she had a superpower. And maybe it's a superpower you have too. You see, as I say, I wasn't a WSM and still am not, and not even a WSW. Not much good at math and science. I'm not athletic. I'm not musical. I can't cook. I can't sew on a button. But I'm a really good storyteller. And furthermore, I'm a really good story finder, really good at helping others tell their stories, and really good at connecting with others through their stories. My mother was too, and her mother was too. So whatever this thing is, it seems to run through the matrilineal in my family anyway. I did not realize that this particular superpower would be helpful to me in medicine or even in life. It took me a really long time to figure this out. I hope it doesn't take you as long if this is your superpower. Anyway, the other thing I see here is a young woman who sort of felt that this moment was the culmination of a choice she'd made years earlier. She was leaving behind her humanities self and embracing her science and medicine self, which didn't fit any better than this coat, nor was any more comfortable. And yet she thought, you know, you can't have both, and I've thrown my lot in with the medical and science people. Now, this was a really wrong-headed way of thinking, as the ancient Greeks would have been very happy to tell you. Apollo, after all, was the god of medicine and poetry. Here he is with his lyre for poetry, his snake for medicine. Just to tag on to what was talked about this morning, and to put this in terms perhaps more congenial to our modern sensibilities, we have a left brain and we have a right brain. And any of you who are practicing medicine know that not only do we need both, but our right brain actually in day-to-day practice comes in handier than our left brain, if indeed they can be separated. And I would go so far as to say that I have come to realize that the novels and poetry I studied as an undergraduate have served me better as a primary care physician than the organic chemistry I crammed to get into medical school, which, well, while I actually did do very well in it, I didn't know what it was then, and I don't know what it is to this day, and have very little use for it in my practice. Now, as I took on this other career as a writer, which, by the way, for those of you who are thinking, oh, it's too late for me, I want to tell you that I started taking night school writing classes in my 40s. I got a master's degree in my 50s and published my essay collection in my 60s, so it isn't too late. But anyway, as I started writing, I kind of started getting really interested in the intersection between my two professional passions. And particularly, I got interested in the history of narrative within medicine. This is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, circa 100 CE. This is a collection of the earliest known written case histories. In case your hieroglyphics are a bit rusty, as mine are, here's case number 4 in a rather stilted Ben-Hur type English. I won't read it in that. So it begins with a hypothetical. When or if you should find someone with a split skull, you don't bind him, you moor him with 2 supports of brick. So this is an early cervical collar until you know that he's stabilized. Now, here's the part that really interests me. You should then do the same for every man with a split skull. The specific to the general. Well, isn't that how we still teach medicine? We don't teach our trainees about diabetes theoretically and generally. We give a few principles, and then we have them learn about this person with diabetes and this person, and that informs how we see the next person. This specific to the general, of course, reminded me of something else too, which is fiction, literature, art. I mean, isn't that the way fiction works? Do we really care about Anna Karenina or Harry Potter or any individual character? Yes, we do. As we turn the pages, we want to know how it will turn out. For spoiler alert, for Anna Karenina, somewhat less well than for Harry Potter. But there, we also read particularly great literature because there is something about the individual story that tells us about human nature generally and about ourselves. So the specific to the general is the way medicine works, and it's the way storytelling works, it's the way fiction works. And I think that particularly for those of us who feel that our specific story is too small, I would say that the delicious paradox of storytelling is that the more specific the story, the more resonant it is, generally. And the more generic the story, the less resonant it is. More on that too in a moment. Now, when I went to graduate school at 52, as I said, I learned about something called the Freytag pyramid. This is a sort of diagram that illustrates how plots work, how stories work. And you can put about any story you can think of into this. First, there's an exposition. You know, we kind of meet the characters, the setting, Cinderella, mean stepmother, mean stepsisters. We know that there's a main character, a protagonist. Something happens, there's going to be a ball, and then a bunch of other stuff happens, gets complicated, and there's the climax, 12 o'clock. Then a bunch of other stuff happens, glass slipper lost, etc. Then there's a resolution, the slipper fits, and then there's a denouement, happily ever after. When I first saw this, I thought, that looks really familiar to me, even though I'd never learned about it. And then I realized why it looked so familiar. It's because that's how I had been telling medical stories my entire career. What is an exposition, after all, but a chief complaint? We call them here now chief concerns, which I think is ever so much nicer. I learned about chief complaints. We meet the protagonist, the main character, the patient. Something happens that brings them to the clinic, to the hospital, to the emergency room. There's this climax, and then a bunch of more stuff happens. We collect the data. There's a resolution or an assessment and plan, a disposition. We diagnose, we admit, we don't admit, and then there's a denouement, hopefully happily ever after. Of course, not always so. Well, why wouldn't storytelling be fundamental to medicine if it's fundamental to how we human beings have evolved to communicate with each other, to build relationships with each other, and to care about each other? So storytelling is fundamentally human, and therefore it's fundamentally relevant to medicine. And further, it shouldn't be very surprising to note that there have been a lot of doctor writers. More doctor writers, I would say, than insurance salesman writers, engineer writers, and carpenter writers, though there have been all of those as well. One of my favorites is the American modernist poet of the early 20th century, William Carlos Williams. One of the things I love about him is that, unlike many of the famous doctor writers of old, he really was a doctor. He practiced more than full-time out of his house in Rutherford, New Jersey, pediatrics and obstetrics. His waiting room was his front porch, and he wrote poems. He wrote poems on his prescription pads. He said, as a writer, I have been a physician, and as a physician, a writer. When I read these words in his autobiography, which I recommend to you, I had a real feeling of validation and homecoming. Now, just for fun, a while back, I started listing all the doctor writers I could think about, more or less in chronological order. And I've obviously missed many, but this is what I noticed, that as we got toward the end of the 20th century, the list started getting a little less male and a little less white. And then I started listing the young doctor writers I knew and admired, including Emily Silverman, who you'll hear from this afternoon. These are folks in their 20s, 30s, early 40s, some of whom I've had the great honor of mentoring, collaborating with. And this list is predominantly female, includes many people of color, and many people from the LGBTQ community. So the doctor-writer field is becoming more and more diverse, and I think this is all to the good. So there are so many reasons we would write. Why wouldn't we? Well, first of all, as you just heard, we're perfectionists. We've been trained to do things quickly and to never make mistakes, which of course is entirely unrealistic and certainly not a good recipe for writing. So we think our stories aren't good enough. I hear this a lot from my students. We're supposed to be about other people's welfare, not our own. We think telling particularly personal stories is self-indulgent. We're concerned legitimately with patient and colleague confidentiality, though there are ways to deal with that. We think our stories might be too revealing, which might be considered unprofessional, and then our patients will know, and our boss will know, and our mom will know, and then everybody will hate us, except I think, honestly, this is mostly internalized self-doubt. And as I've been pretty self-revelatory in my writing in the last few years, I can tell you I've not received anything but positive reinforcement from my boss, my patients, and, well, my mom is gone, but she would have loved it. Anecdotal medicine is sort of a dirty word. Oh, you're practicing anecdotal medicine. You're not practicing evidence-based medicine. More on that in a moment. That's a bit of a bugaboo of mine. I think we practice anecdotal medicine all the time and in wonderful ways. And then finally, we think what we have to say is so small in relation to big problems, like, for example, our patients' problems, or, for example, the world falling apart. But what we underestimate is the potency, again, of the small story. I published a piece right at the beginning of the pandemic in the New England Journal of Medicine, about which, just before it went to press, I had a lot of hesitation. I thought, gosh, my colleagues are risking their lives and, people are dying, and here I'm writing about my tiny little insignificant, not particularly noteworthy experience. But I wrote about it with honesty, I think. And guess what? I got mail from those people on the front lines thanking me for speaking for them in a particular way. So don't underestimate the power of, yes, your small story. More on anecdotal medicine. So we practice it when we take care of patients, right? We treat our patients one story at a time. We don't treat our patients as if they were, case series or meta-analyses. We certainly teach using the case method in medical education. The case report is still a valued part of research, and it's a very valuable tool in the advancement of public health, where stories speak much more powerfully than statistics, as we all know. So, what are the benefits of storytelling? We know that storytelling can relieve stress, heal trauma for our patients, also for ourselves. We can use storytelling to educate and inform our colleagues and the public. We can amplify and advocate for voices less often heard. We can expose injustices and advance policy, legislative, and cultural change. And we can even make meaning and beauty out of the bleakest subject matter. And just as medicine has subspecialties, writing about medicine has subspecialties. Perhaps you're drawn more to the editorial or perspective vein. the educational or journalistic approach. And then there's personal essay and memoir, which is my genre. So, what should I write about, you might be asking yourself? Well, here's some thoughts. First, write about what obsesses you. This was the advice of one of my wonderful graduate school teachers who used to say, start with the chocolate and save the broccoli for later. Unless you really like broccoli more than you like chocolate, which nobody does. Write about what you're afraid to write about. Yeah, hate to tell you, but this is probably the best way to start, the most rich, fruitful way to start. That thing that you think is just too weird and too idiosyncratic and nobody would ever understand, that's the thing everybody's going to relate to, I promise. We're often told to write what you know, and that's not bad advice, but even better advice is to write what you want to know. Every single thing I have published, every single essay in my book started with a moment that looked like this. Wait a minute. Why did I think it was a good idea to get pregnant when I was a first-year trainee working 110 hours a week? Why didn't anybody say anything? And then I ended up with, yeah, that all seemed like a bad idea. What was that all about? Why didn't I notice that there were so few women in that picture until decades later, etc.? And not only, if you do know the answer, if you already know what the concluding paragraph looks like, don't bother. Flannery O'Connor said, a great American author of the American South, said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And we all have read these things that just sort of sit there dead. Why? Because the writer was not in any process of discovery when they wrote it. Joan Didion famously said, I don't know what I think until I try to write it down. So if you're thinking, I don't know what to write, good. That's the starting point. Now, here's just a brief tour of my writing career. In 1998, I stumbled upon what would end up being my method of writing. I got to thinking one December why it was that my father, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he was an orthopedic surgeon in private practice, bags of presents every December. There was liquor and little velvet pouches and world's greatest doctor coffee mugs, and I didn't get anything. Nothing. Well, okay, I got a tin of cookies, biscuits, I guess you call them, homemade biscuits from one patient, and they actually weren't even that good. But what was that about? So I just started writing about it, and I thought, was this a male-female thing? Was it a difference in the eras? Was it a difference in the specialties? Was my father a better doctor than I was? What was it about? And I made it a little funny, and I sent it to the Journal of the American Medical Association, and they published it. And I got mail from all over the world, including from a doctor somewhere who said, I was in the Army in World War II with your dad, say hello. That was fun. Anyway, I thought, well, this writing thing, this publishing thing, this is pretty easy. You just write some stuff and you send it, and then they publish it. And so I tried that again as my friend. Well, she wasn't. And it turns out that a writing career, as I learned, is full of rejection, which most medical careers are not. And it's not particularly linear, as medical careers tend to be. Well, then, and by the way, the next publication I had in a major medical journal was 12 years later. So but a bunch of stuff happened in between, including I started a blog in the magazine Psychology Today. And this blog, I don't think anybody read it, and I didn't make any money, but it was incredibly useful because I noticed I was writing about the same thing over and over again in different ways. I was writing about the stories behind the cases. And, this process that I'm going to describe here is so similar to what you heard this morning from Ronan and Roger about developing your clinical voice. There's a little trial and error. You see what fits. I know when I started in practice, I was terribly formal because I thought, I'm a young woman. Nobody's going to take me seriously unless I wear a white coat and I'm very stiff. It didn't work for me, but it took me a while to figure that out. And similarly, this is how you develop your writing voice. And it's a little bit of a Goldilocks phenomenon, that, too hot, too cold, just right. It's not important that you don't make mistakes. In fact, you have to make mistakes. What's important is that when you make a mistake, you're honest with yourself about what that, what's working for you and what's not. So here was a mistake I made. What? You got published in the New Yorker. My kind of writing. It was fun to see my name in that hallowed font, but it wasn't me. And I did it a couple of times, and then I stopped because it wasn't me. This was more me, writing a column in our local paper, the Boston Globe. I sometimes enlisted patients, including a nurse in our hospital who was dying of ovarian cancer. I asked her what I could do for her, and she said, put me in the newspaper. And I said, well, what do you want me to say about you? She said, I don't know, but use my name. And I'll come back tomorrow and I'll tell you. Well, what she wanted me to say about her was that she wished she had been referred to palliative care earlier by her oncologist, and yes, by me. And so I wrote about this. The editor, bless his heart, rushed it to publication so that she could see it before she died. It went in ahead of schedule. And we heard from people around the world, from every continent other than Antarctica, about people who had benefited from palliative care. This was enormously heartening to her and her family. She read all the messages, and boy, talk about a moment when my doctor life and my writing life weren't different. This was certainly one. And then I started writing very personal essays for the New England Journal of Medicine. I wrote about daddy issues. I wrote about my psychosomatic symptoms. I also started book reviewing and running reading groups in my hospital. So this interest and this integration of the hospital and my literary life were coming together. And then, as John Lennon is supposed to have said, but apparently he didn't say it, life is what happens while you're making other plans. I thought, well, now it's time for me to write a book. The book I was going to write was about how I, a practitioner of women's health, entirely missed the diagnosis of my own mother's coronary disease, and how she presented to my emergency room to be diagnosed with a massive anterior MI by my colleagues. Quite a story, quite a book. Only I didn't get anywhere with it. I put in about 500 pages over 3 years, and I was stalled. So I did what writers do when we procrastinate, which is we cheat on one writing project by going to a different writing project. And the writing project I went to culminated again in one of those moments where I was facilitating a writing exercise for incoming interns at our hospital. Write a letter to your future self. I found myself unexpectedly moved by this. And I decided, well, I did this 30 years ago. What letter would I send to my past self I didn't know what I would say, so therefore I knew I had something to say. And this is what I wrote, and it kind of went a little bit viral and was picked up by the lay press. I talked about my own imposter syndrome and about the decades I had wasted feeling like a fraud. And I received an email from an editor who wanted to know if I wanted to write a book of essays like this. And I said, no, I can't do that. I'm working on a memoir about how I killed my mother. And she said, okay. And then a year later, I circled back because I realized that as devastating as that other story was, it wasn't really true. And certainly my mother wouldn't have thought it was true. This led to this book, and I just like to just finish up by saying, well, where do you begin? It feels so overwhelming, plus you have a day job. Well, don't think about writing about my life or my career or even, my patient interactions. Start with a moment you felt unsure, moved, puzzled. Write down everything. What did people wear? How did they sound? What did the room look like? And then be prepared for the fact, I hope, that the story that emerges is a different one than you thought you were writing. That's when you know you're on the right track. This is Lassie, the preternaturally clever collie. People of a certain age in the States will think this is funny. Lassie was always getting help for people in quicksand, but here Lassie is getting a different kind of help. And we need help too. We need feedback, deadlines. We need community, even though writing is a solitary subject, courses, degrees, etc. I'd like to put in a plug for the course I co-direct at Harvard Medical School, Media and Medicine. We gather folks from all over the world, and we talk not only about writing, but also about podcasting. Emily Silverman does that, and filmmaking and disinformation and misinformation and just all kinds of wonderful things. And then finally, before we get to our conversation, which I hope we have a few minutes for, I just want to read the last couple of sentences of that original essay, which opens my book. It's what I wish someone had said to me, not only as a young doctor, but also as a not so young novice writer. I didn't say it to myself, so I'll say it to you. My dear young colleague, you are not a fraud. You are a flawed and unique human being with excellent training and an admirable sense of purpose. Your training and sense of purpose will serve you well. Your humanity will serve your patients, and I should say your readers, better.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was so much in there. I feel like at the start of your book, there's a quote from your mother where she says, "Tell me everything." And that's what I feel like saying to you. Just tell me everything. Tell me it all so that I can know it all. But particularly, I guess, when we look at those barriers that doctors might have to telling their own story, which I think you had a really helpful look through the different types of barriers that doctors might either perceive or indeed have. And these are the stories that we tell ourselves about why we can't tell our stories. And I'm wondering if you might be able to maybe pick through some of those for us. I suppose the one that's particularly interesting is our sense of perfectionism, the idea of how you could do something and not be absolutely expert at it straight away, or know that you're going to be an expert at it, which of course you can't do with writing. So I'm interested to hear the solution to this particular problem.
I will solve this problem for you.
Excellent. I knew you would.
And much more. I'm going to solve this. So I read a quote recently from the American novelist Amy Bender. She said, "There is no book in your head." I think a really common cause of writer's block is this idea that the book exists and all you need to do is somehow receive it and transcribe it. Mm-hmm. And then, here's what happens. Okay. You get this great idea. It's just so great. And then you start writing it, and it's bad. And then you say, well, yeah, I knew I was bad at this. And then you say, okay, that's enough for today. I'll try again tomorrow. And then you try again tomorrow, and it's still bad. And you think, well, okay, enough. I'm bad at this. The reason why it's helpful to take courses, do workshops, and so forth is that, we as doctors, I wrote a piece about this in the Lancet called What's the Story? We have certain things against us as doctors, not the least of which is our perfectionism. Mm-hmm. But we have certain advantages as doctors, which is that we are really good at hitting deadlines. My editor at Norton told me I'm the only author in the history of the universe who ever had their draft in the day it was due. I'm sure that's somewhat hyperbolic, but I was sitting there at 8 a.m. with my finger over the send button. Why? Because that's how we were trained. So here's the thing. If you're in a course and somebody tells you your essay is due on Monday, you're sending that thing in, even if it's not good. Mm. And then, okay, except then you send it in. Let me just finish the cycle here. You send it in and you think one of two things. Actually, you think both. You think this is horrible. It's like it's not even comprehensible. It's awful. It's embarrassing. Mm. But secretly, you think, this is so incredible that my teacher's probably gonna offer me publication immediately. Guess what? Neither of those is true. It's not awful, and it's not ready for publication. So get over it. And then, as of course Samuel Beckett said, you fail and then you fail better. Mm. And then you fail better, and then you fail better. The medical culture, we're not big on revision. We don't tell people, try this patient, it doesn't work out, just crumple it and then move on. No, that's not how we do. Well, we probably do more than we admit, but that's not how we do. Here, you make a mistake, you make a mess, and then you keep going and you revise and you revise and you revise and you revise. And as one American writer I heard once put it, somewhat less eloquently than Samuel Beckett, each time you suck less. But that takes the pressure off of it. And oh, by the way, don't buy a fancy pen and a fancy journal.
I got free ones.
Yeah, free is good. Yeah. Don't go out and buy them. Yeah.
But it is interesting that idea of drafts, as we were saying before, that for doctors, we think we don't have drafts in our patients and in our practice, but unfortunately, of course, we do, and we need to maybe take the opportunity of drafts as writing as being a way of getting used to failure and acceptance of failure and seeing it as a way of moving forward and improving. So I think there's probably lessons to be learned, and perhaps that is a way that we can encourage doctors to write, is again appealing to their altruistic tendencies. You're writing it for something, to help somebody else, to do something for somebody else, and that can be a way of getting over our hesitancy about having that indulgence about talking about ourselves.
Yes, it's not an act of indulgence. It's an act of great generosity, in fact. And I hear this again and again and again.
And I suppose the other major question that tends to come up when people are talking about doctors writing is around the confidentiality. So the idea of talking about patients. And again, you giving that truth to the story and dealing with what that might mean for the person who might be reading it or for somebody who might be able to identify themselves in the story. And I think that those doctors who do write often have to think a little bit more about how they're going to manage that. So I'd love to hear how you manage that.
Sure. It depends a lot on the kind of writing you do and where you publish. If you publish in a newspaper, you have to either use the right name or no name, and you can't change details, newspapers I've written for anyway. If you write for magazines or even medical journals, such as the New England Journal of the Lancet, you can change everything. You can change professions, genders, anything. My own practice is that if a patient could even remotely recognize themselves in a story, I run it by them first. But the other thing too is that what I sort of recognize, and this is just me, it's not for everybody, is I'm not really writing about the patients, I'm writing about myself. And so, I have a passage in my book about somebody who got an unusual infection while working as a butcher's apprentice. None of that happened. They got something else, doing something else. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't relevant to the story I wanted to tell, whether it was a this or whether it was a that. Mm-hmm. And only you can figure out whether it's relevant. I think a lot of these concerns are like the perfectionism, like what will my boss say? A lot of this is resistance to the writing. I like the quote of the American writer and writing teacher Anne Lamott, who says, "Just write what you need to write, and we'll call the lawyers later." Which I think is a good way of thinking about it. This is, by the way, how Oliver Sacks, very late in his life, was encouraged to write about the long period of his life in which he was a closeted gay man. His editor said to him, when he was a pretty shy person, said to him, just write it out, and we don't have to include what you don't want to include when we publish. Once he had written it out, he felt he could include anything. And that's so often the case. We're afraid to see ourselves on the page, even when no one else is looking. Mm.
That is so true, and it is that vulnerability then, I guess, that is both off-putting, but also the value that we can bring for others. Thank you so much, Suzanne. I realize we're running out of time, and of course we haven't even got to talk about all of the kind of things that I like to talk about in terms of women in medicine and how that might have been, and how you recently, recognized that you were one of very few women in that picture. But I'm really hoping that we get that opportunity to have that conversation another time, because I know people would be very interested in that as well. So I'd just like to say, do you have something else to say? Sorry.
I just wanted to say, I so wish that I was there to be having that conversation, and for all the hugs. Consider yourselves virtually hugged by me. And I hope we meet again in other ways. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thanks a lot.